Hi again, ladies and gentlemen. It's Mr. Crawford. We're starting video number 2 of this 3-part series on soil. Before I go on, I just want to remind you that the best way to get a hold of me is to reach me at my email, which you see there on screen. It's rcrawford@jcpsmail.org. That is positively the best way to get a hold of me if you need help or if you're confused about what to do. All right, without any further ado, let's take a look at today's video. So to start with, I want to look at 3 important terms that we learned or that we discussed in the last video. And so these 3 vocabulary words are deposition, erosion, and weathering. On the right-hand side, you're going to see that I have the meaning or the definition for those 3 words that was from the video. Take just a moment and see if you can match the word to the correct definition. Hit the pause button for your video now and give that a shot. You can hit play again when you're done. All right, I hope that you did well. Of course, when we talked last week, we said that weathering, which is number 3, is that process that breaks rock down into smaller and smaller pieces. We said that breaks it. We talked about that the broken down rock is called sediment, and once you have sediment, that sediment can be carried to a new location, which is B. And of course, we're talking about erosion, so 2 would match with B. And finally, process of elimination, we look at deposition, and deposition is just the process where sediment is dropped in a new location or drops it. So weathering breaks it, erosion moves it, and deposition drops it. So hopefully, if knowing a little bit about weathering and erosion, when we start thinking about how soil forms from what we call parent rock, we now can understand that if we take solid rock and we expose it to water, expose it to the elements, that it's going to begin breaking down, and over many thousands of years, we're going to end up with soil. And so when we look at soil, and we said there were 5 parts to soil last week, we know that we have this mixture of rocks and minerals, aka the stuff that's produced from rocks via weathering. We have air and water, but we're also going to need to look a little bit more at this stuff called organic matter. What does that even mean? Now, you guys have probably seen that word organic in the grocery store, and to some of you that probably means all natural or grown without chemicals, but it means something quite a bit different in science. So when we look at organic matter is only a small part. It's only a very small part of what we might find when we look at a soil sample. Really less than 5%, even in a very healthy soil. So organic matter, we need to understand it, we need to compare it to what it's not. Okay, so let's look at organic matter versus inorganic matter. So organic matter is just any material. It's anything that that is living or was once living. So by this definition, that means you're living. That means you are organic matter. That means if we're walking along the sidewalk and we find a dead insect or an insect, that means that those things are organic matter. If we look at any material that from a plant, whether it's living or no longer living, whether we're looking at branches or twigs or leaves or roots, that is organic matter. When we look at things that are microscopic, also organic matter. Now, if we look at things similar to animal droppings, poop, that is also a form of organic matter because it was produced by something that was alive. Now, inorganic matter really is just quite the opposite. That prefix "in" means not. So inorganic just means that it's any material that was not made by a living organism. And the most common example of that are things like rocks and minerals, things like air, things like water, all of those things are examples of inorganic matter. So organic matter was once living or is living or was made by something that was once living or is living, and inorganic matter is not made by living organisms at all. So we have two types of organic matter that we're going to find in the soil. The first one, and I'm looking to the left, is called litter. Sometimes this is called surface litter. And surface litter is what you're used to seeing as you take a walk through the woods or the forest. And we're talking about these fresh, recognizable pieces of organic matter that's at the surface. Things like fallen leaves, animal droppings. You might run into even a dead organism, maybe a mouse or a bird that has passed and moved on. So any of those things that we find lying at the surface that are still recognizable, we say that those things are litter. Now, the other type of organic matter is, and I don't want to say that it's a different thing because actually it's the same thing. It's just litter after it's been transformed. And that word is humus. That word is not hummus, the word is humus. And so humus is not fresh, it's old, and it's completely decayed, and it is no longer recognizable organic matter. And if we look at that picture, we can see that that soil has a very nice chocolate brown color to it. The reason that soil is so dark is because that organic material that was once at the surface has decayed, it's been completely broken down, and slowly it's leached its way or it's made its way down into that top layer or that top bit of soil. So, two types of organic matter, really the same stuff, but it's just been transformed over time. We have the fresh, recognizable pieces at the surface. We call that litter. And then we have the old, completely decayed, unrecognizable stuff that's actually in the soil. We call that humus. So remember, when we talk about organic matter, we're talking about less than 5% of a typical soil sample. Yeah, if for those of you who've never had this before and don't know what I'm talking about, when I said don't confuse humus with hummus, this is hummus. This is ground up chickpeas uh, that you can buy at the grocery store. Either you love it or you hate it. But humus is what we find in the soil. Hummus is what we find in a container at the grocery store. So please don't confuse those two. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, surface litter turns into humus by decaying. And this takes some time. And if we look at this picture, we can see all sorts of signs of decay. This is a picture of a pumpkin, and we can see that that pumpkin is changing color. That's of course a chemical reaction. We can see some mold growing on it. Those white splotchy places, those are molds growing on it. We can see the darkening of color, which is also a sign of putrefaction, which is bacteria that's beginning to, and maybe mold that's beginning to break apart the pumpkin. But so we're talking about surface litter to humus, we're talking about decay. And when we talk about decay, we need to talk about the process called decomposition. Now, some of you may know this as rotting. Maybe you've more commonly would use that term, but the scientific word that we would use for decomposition, or the scientific term that we would use would be decomposition. And so, really, this is just a process where any organic material is broken down into much simpler substances. The reason that we care about decomposition is because it's going to release these really important nutrients that can be recycled and used over and over. Some of you have heard of the carbon cycle or the phosphorus cycle or the nitrogen cycle, and really decomposition is one of those processes that releases these minerals. These are things that we can find on the periodic table, these elements. It releases them so that they can be used over and over. There is not enough carbon on Earth for it not to be reused. And so for living things and living systems, its decomposition is a really important part of what's called a nutrient cycle, meaning the cycling of material to be used by living things over and over again. Now, decomposition, to talk about decomposition or rot, we need to think of this group of organisms that is responsible for this. And we talked earlier in the year about these things called producers, organisms that make their own food. We also talked about consumers, organisms that get their food or energy by eating something else, consuming it. And so now we need to look a little bit at these decomposers. Decomposers is just a group of organisms that get their energy that they need by breaking down the remains of dead stuff. Really, the most common way I've seen these talked about is many scientists will call these nature's recyclers. And so when we look at these decomposers, we have the primary two decomposers are something called fungi and bacteria. So we're talking about things that are really microscopic. Um, in a soil sample, we might have millions and millions of these tiny microscopic living things, these decomposers that are there that are breaking apart anything that falls to the ground, whether it be logs or twigs or leaves or droppings. Decomposers are there um, to take the energy out of it and to recycle it. Most times, I like to think of decomposers as the FBI. FBI is just a really short way for us to remember the three major groups: fungi, bacteria, and insects. So, despite the fact insects don't appear here, there are many insects that are indeed decomposers who get their energy from primarily breaking down plant material or any other organic matter that drops to the ground. And so, these decomposers, one way to think of it is what's responsible for converting surface litter or litter into humus. And humus is very good for plants. It makes soil more fertile. So, decomposers. Now, I want to take just one moment because many of you think fungi and you think of this thing to the right. You think of this mushroom. But really, a fungi is something that often lives in the soil. It can live in logs or any other thing that it happens to be feeding on. But really, the fungi looks more like this thing on the left. These long thread-like or white, fuzzy, sort of stringy uh, filaments. I don't know what else to call them. If you've ever dug around in the soil or at the surface of the soil or around a log, you will have absolutely seen these. Now, the mushroom itself is really just the above ground fruit. It's how a fungi reproduces. So the fungus is often underground and you don't normally see it, but the mushroom is the fruit, similar to how an apple, you might find an apple on an apple tree. An apple is the fruit and it's also used for reproduction, just like the mushroom is the fruit, which is used for reproduction, not by a plant, but by a fungi. So take a look for these as you're out and about on your day. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to go back through this video for just a moment, and I want you to look for the definitions for these words. So some important vocab for today is litter, humus, decomposition, and decomposer. If you'll please add these to your science notebook, I'm going to pause and wait for you to get that done. All right, welcome back. So I have another activity that I want you to try today. And this lab is going to be you looking for some examples of decomposition. And I just want you to look for examples around your house. I want you to begin in your house. And so, you're going to want to look wherever there's organic matter. And so the most common place we're going to find organic matter in our home is in the kitchen or in the pantry. So really what we're going to look for is things that are spoiled or moldy. And I want you to, if you can find something in your pantry, I want you to carefully take a look at it. I want you to look and see if you can spot some molds or maybe a fungus. If you smell a smell that is not pleasant, oftentimes that's a sign of bacteria. And so I want you to start out in your home. After you get done, I want you to go ahead and continue your list. I want you to look for examples of decomposition outside. As always, tell an adult where you're going to be, and I want you to get permission. When you're outside, you can look for things like animal droppings, old logs. If you have a compost pile where you put scrap food, any place where you have organic matter, maybe you just want to pull aside the grass in your lawn and sort of look down next to the soil. I want you to observe and look and see what is happening. See, I want you to look for that decomposition. Look how it's changing that litter and through that process of decomposition. Now, if you have some woods nearby you, a really fun thing to do is to go and to rake back the leaves and look at rake back the fresh leaves from last fall and look under there. One thing that I believe you'll be able to spot, you may be able to spot some fungi hard at work. So I want you to look for some feathery, white, stringy. I want you to look for some fungi. Remember, a mushroom is just the fruit. I want you to try to find the fungi itself. See if you can find that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you a lot to do. I hope things are going well for you at home, and I will see you again soon. Thanks.